Monosodium glutamate, or MSG, has often been vilified. In recent times, research has proved that it actually doesn't give most people any troubles when consumed in reasonable normal amounts. Don't worry though, this didn't just become a cooking show. Or maybe some of you wish that it would. The point is that MSG and today's product have a lot in common. With the Cayin RU9 though, you don't have to worry about this giving you a headache. Even with no research, I can assure you that the only thing the Cayin RU9 is ever going to give you is a great big smile on your face. And that's a hint at why the RU9 is a lot like MSG. Just like MSG improves the taste and flavour of any food you put it into, this little DAC and headphone amp improves the sound of anything you plug into it. And unlike the heavy-handed chef at your local Chinese restaurant, you have full control of how much or how little enjoyment you add to the mix with the RU9. But we'll get to the details on that in a moment. First, let's talk about why this may not be exactly what you're expecting if you're partially familiar with Cayin's other products. When Cayin reached out to me and asked if I'd like to review the RU9, I jumped at the chance. I'd really enjoyed their RU6 R2R dongle DAC and figured that this being the RU9 would be a bigger and better version of that dongle DAC. It's not though. There is no R2R DAC to be found here. Instead, it uses a pair of AK4493 DAC chips used in a dual mono setup. In other words, one of the chips only handles left channel music and the other chip only handles right channel music. That maximizes channel separation and can improve things like imaging and clarity. And it was only after much listening to the RU9 that I even discovered its DAC architecture. I didn't look at the box when it arrived, I just started listening. I like the AK4493 DAC chips, but I would never have predicted that what I was hearing from the RU9 was being produced by a pair of those DAC chips. It's far better than I would have expected had I known that those were the chips involved. But we shouldn't spend too long talking about the DAC inside the RU9 because that's not really what makes it special. Before we get to the juicy part, let's talk quickly about the connectivity of the RU9 and about today's video sponsor. This is a longer video than I'd actually planned for this review, and so I'm going to keep this super fast. DAC Audio make all kinds of audio accessories for earphones and headphones, including their fantastic modular cable range. And so if you need new pads or cables for your headphones, maybe ear tips for your earphones, or carry cases and comfort accessories for your headphones, then you need to check out the range at DACaudio.com. And while you're there, be sure to use the code PassionForSound10 at the checkout to enjoy 10% off anything and everything you purchase. See? Told you it would be quick. Let's talk about connectivity on the RU9. You can send coaxial, USB, and Bluetooth signals into the Cayin RU9. And it's got Bluetooth codecs including aptX HD and LDAC, so you're going to get maximum possible Bluetooth sound short of aptX lossless, which is still pretty rare. The RU9 is also capable of converting all different types of files up to DSD512 and 768 kHz PCM. It's then going to output those signals either through a 3.5mm unbalanced or a 4.4mm balanced output. In between the DAC and those headphone outputs though is where the magic happens here. And we should talk about the price of that magic before we go too far. The Cayin RU9 looks and feels like a premium portable DAC because that's what it is. It costs $499 and so it's right up there with other premium devices like the xDuoo XD05T and the Chord Mojo 2. And we're going to revisit both of those a little bit later to contextualize the performance of the RU9. Where the RU9 is a little bit different from both of those though, is that it's MagSafe compatible, meaning that if you've got a case on your phone or if your phone has it built in, the RU9 will stick to the back of it perfectly. The RU9 does also ship with this sort of bluey purpley case that's also meant to be MagSafe compatible, but in my time using it I found that the magnetic connection from the case was actually a bit too weak for the weight of the device, and it kept falling off. So if you do want to run this as a MagSafe type DAC, you're going to need to go commando to get it to stay securely fitted. But that's enough of the boring stuff. Let's talk now about sound And that means understanding the 3 different ways that the RU9 can produce that sound. Or actually, there's kind of 4 ways if you include the hyper mode in the RU9. By running this while connected to a suitable USB-C power source in the red power socket on the bottom and flicking the switch into DC mode, you'll automatically trigger the RU9 to go into what's called hyper mode. That's going to give you significantly more power if you want to drive demanding headphones. That mode will boost the power output from the 4.4mm balance socket to 1 watt into 32 ohm headphones. If you're using the unbalanced 3.5mm output, it's going to boost it to 420 milliwatts. Without the hyper mode active, you're still getting strong power output from the RU9 with 620 milliwatts into 32 ohm headphones from the balanced output and 310 milliwatts from the unbalanced output. Realistically, there are very few headphones that this can't send you deaf with, even without hyper mode active. And so with that detail covered about hyper mode and power outputs, let's talk about really the 3 different modes of operation of the RU9. And those 3 output modes revolve around the inclusion or exclusion of tubes. I say tubes, but they're not your regular run-of-the-mill orange glowy tubes. Instead, the RU9 uses the Korg Nu tube. And that's why the internal glow from this device is a pale blue rather than a warm orange. It's not a fake light though. What you see through the casework on the front here of the RU9 are actual tubes, they're just a different sort. And we should talk briefly about the difference between Korg Nu tubes and traditional tubes. But let's save that for when we get to talking about the xDuoo5T comparison, because it's using traditional tubes, so it's more relevant there. For now, let's just talk about the influence that the Nu tubes have on what you'll be hearing from the RU9. Starting in solid state mode with the RU9, in other words without the tubes involved in the circuit, the sound is clean, detailed and probably unremarkable. It sounds just like a good, portable DAC and headphone amp. It's probably impressive for a DAC built around a pair of AK4493s and some OPA 1662 op amps, but this video would be a very different video if that was all there was to the RU9. If you're buying the RU9, you're buying it because it's got tubes in it. Clicking the mode button on the side of the RU9 will move from solid state mode into classic mode. There's a short countdown and the signal cuts off briefly while the tubes warm up, and then you're greeted with something truly special. In classic mode, the tubes are in full effect. In this mode, there is no global feedback used to squash distortion, and that does mean that the THD figures will be much higher in classic mode. But because that distortion is coming from tubes, it's generally going to be pleasurable to most people. Whether it's due to the added distortion, or the lack of feedback, or maybe a bit of both, the classic mode on the RU9 is its most spacious and 3-dimensional version. It's an absolutely brilliant presentation that envelops you in a wonderfully natural and lifelike soundscape. The soundstage is probably a little bit narrower in classic mode than it is in solid state mode, but the central image is wonderfully focused and weighty, and the soundstage stretches out behind that central image with plenty of layering as well. Each individual instrument is beautifully placed and focused within the soundstage in classic mode, and the sound is also significantly warmer and richer compared to solid state mode. For some people, classic mode may be too rich and warm, and it's also going to partly depend on the headphones or the earphones you're plugging into it. But that is why the mode button exists. One more press of the mode button will trigger a fresh countdown and another short pause in the sound before you move into what's called modern mode. In modern mode, the tubes are still active, but now there's some global feedback applied to pull out some or maybe all of the extra harmonic distortion. Importantly though, it doesn't negate the sound of the tubes, and so what you're really getting now is a perfect middle ground between the very clean and detailed solid state mode and the very rich and lush and spacious classic mode. You do lose a tiny bit of that sense of space in modern mode compared to classic mode, but the overall presentation is still very spacious and still has that wonderful depth and layering in the soundstage, even if it's slightly less of it. Modern mode also raises the sense of clarity and resolution a little bit, and so you are still getting a dash of what I'd call tubey warmth, but the sound is just slightly warm or slightly smooth rather than really thick and rich. And I found that my preference between the modes came down a lot to which earphones or headphones I was using at the time. In most cases, I prefer the space and the three-dimensionality of classic mode, but occasionally with certain warmer tuned IEMs or headphones, I would prefer the slightly less warm and lush sound of the modern mode. But I don't think I'd ever really use the RU9 in its solid state mode because, as I said before, it's largely unremarkable unless you're using the tubes. It's good, it's just not better or different from so many other products. To me, using the RU9 in solid state mode feels like a missed opportunity because I know just how special it can sound with those tubes engaged. As I said, there are plenty of devices that can deliver the sort of sound that the RU9 delivers in solid state mode, but there are very few devices, if any, that can deliver the type of sound that the RU9 delivers once you've engaged those Korg Nu tubes. And that's probably a really good segue into some comparisons. Before we get to the comparisons with other devices though, let's do a quick comparison between the 4.4mm balanced socket and the 3.5mm unbalanced socket. Thankfully, both outputs are excellent, but the 4.4mm balanced output is a little bit more excellent. You get a touch more sense of clarity and separation of sounds from the 4.4mm socket, and a slightly wider soundstage too. But it is a very subtle difference, and I would gladly use the RU9 with either output. So don't feel like you have to go 4.4mm with the RU9. It's one of those products where you really don't have to worry. With that said, I did only use the 4.4mm socket as I compared the RU9 with the xDuoo XD05T. This is xDuoo's own version of a portable hybrid DAC and headphone amp. The two of these products cost about the same, but they're quite different in many ways. As you can see, the XD05T is much larger and a bit heavier than the RU9 is. This also is a little bit more powerful. It's got a bass boost switch if you want that, and it can take analog inputs to work as a pure amplifier if you want to feed it from some other DAC. Neither of these offers particularly strong battery life, but interestingly, the RU9 is a little bit stronger. The RU9 will deliver about 4.7 hours of battery life if you're running only from the battery inside. In other words, you can connect it so that it's charging or drawing power from, say, a smartphone as it's playing, and that will be supported by the battery. But if it's pure battery only, about 4.7 hours. That relatively small amount of battery life in today's modern age is due to the fact that the tubes are chewing more power, but the fact that the smaller RU9 has more battery power or battery life than the bigger XD05T starts to give us an insight into the differences between the tubes in each. The Korg Nu tubes in the RU9 do work in basically the same way as a traditional vacuum tube. And what I mean by that is that there's going to be a heated wire or filament in there, and that's called the cathode, and that's going to emit electrons as it's heated. Those electrons are then attracted towards a different wire or plate called the anode. As those electrons try to move from the cathode to the anode, they have to pass through a mesh, which is referred to as the grid. The musical signal is passed through that grid, and because a musical signal is essentially just fluctuating voltages, that's going to change how rapidly the electrons can pass through the grid on their way to the anode. And so the electrons arriving at that anode end up as a direct copy of the musical signal that's passing through the grid from moment to moment. That's exactly the same whether we're talking about a Nu tube or a traditional vacuum tube. Where the Nu tubes differ is in the way they're constructed and the materials used. Nu tubes are constructed in much the same way as vacuum fluorescent displays used in things like digital clocks, microwave displays, any of those simple digital displays. They're generally much smaller than vacuum tubes and also can run on much lower voltages. That means they produce significantly less heat, and that improves their longevity. In fact, a Nu tube like those in the RU9 can last about 3 times longer than a vacuum tube like, say, a 12AX7. And that means you can expect around about 30,000 hours of performance out of a Nu tube depending on the exact setup. That sounds really good, but there is a drawback. Because of their low voltage operation, Nu tubes are not very powerful when it comes to amplification. In other words, they won't make things particularly loud. And that's why in the RU9, the Nu tubes are paired with JFET transistors both before and after the tubes within. Those help to boost the power output and mean that you can enjoy the sound of the Nu tubes without being severely limited on power output. In other words, you're getting the sound of tubes and the power of solid state. On the other hand, if we think about the xDuoo 5T again for a moment, it's using a more traditional vacuum tube in the form of the 6N16B tubes. That said, both devices deliver a satisfyingly tube-like sound. With the bass boost switch in the off position on the xDuoo 5T, these two devices do sound quite similar. Before I could properly describe the sound though, I had to swap away from my custom Fur Audio Radon 6 IEMs over to the Hyphaman HE600 headphones. That review's coming soon, make sure you subscribe. The reason I had to make that change is because the xDuoo 5T produces significant hiss and noise through REMs, as well as some noticeable microphonics from the tubes. With headphones, the xDuoo 5T is silent, unless you bump it and make those microphonics start up again, but with REMs, not so much. And by the way, if you're wondering what microphonics are, it's the sound created if you send any vibrations through the tubes while it's in operation. So with the xDuoo 5T, it is a little bit susceptible to rattles and bumps and knocks while you're listening. With the RU9, I didn't ever once hear any microphonics, even with sensitive REMs. Perhaps that's another benefit of the new tubes, or perhaps it's to do with how the RU9 has been built internally. Either way, using the HE600 headphones instead of earphones, I felt like the xDuoo 5T might have had a slightly more sparkly top end. But it was difficult to tell because at the same time, I felt like the xDuoo 5T had the slightly richer overall tonality or feel through the music. At least that's when I had the RU9 in modern mode. The reason I say it was a little bit tricky is because I feel like the xDuoo 5T was maybe a little bit richer through the mid-range and into the bass, but the treble was maybe a tiny bit grainier than what I was getting from the RU9, again in modern mode. And to be clear here, I'm talking in contrasts, and so what I mean is that the xDuoo 5T is by no means harsh or grainy, it's just comparably a little bit sparklier, a little bit more etched in the treble when compared to the very smooth RU9. And that goes a step further. If you switch the RU9 into its classic mode, it gets extra tubey and very, very smooth. In other words, the RU9 can flex more into that tubey sound if you want that. But beyond that, if you're comparing the xDuoo 5T with the RU9 in its modern mode, both are very comparable, I think. I think the RU9 brings the vocals just a touch closer to you as a listener and creates therefore a slightly more intimate feel. But at the same time, the RU9 probably delivers a little bit more layering and depth in the soundstage. So it's not like things get more congested with the RU9, they just bring the vocalist a little bit closer. And ultimately, the differences between these are just that. They're differences, they're not pros and cons as such. The RU9 and the xDuoo 5T aren't clearly better or worse than one another, they're just a little bit different. All I can really say is that I really enjoy both, but I do prefer the RU9. And that comes down to a combination of the general sound character I prefer, just because of personal preferences, the versatility of having different modes I prefer, and then I prefer the fact that it's more compact and able to be used with REMs and or headphones. On the other hand, if you needed the bass boost, a little bit more output power, and or the ability to run it as a pure amplifier, the xDuoo 5T is still a fantastic choice. You can't really go wrong with either of these. Both produce a wonderfully enjoyable musical experience with headphones. For REM users, it does have to be the RU9 because of hiss and noise from the xDuoo 5T. However, depending on where you live, there is another device you might want to consider. In some parts of the world, especially in the UK, the Chord Mojo 2 costs about the same as the Cayin RU9. It's also not dissimilar in size and has fairly comparable connectivity. The Mojo 2 has significantly better battery life because there's no tubes in here, but there's no 4.4mm connection, at least not yet. I believe there's a new slight update coming soon. And the Mojo 2 is also not MagSafe compatible if you want to magnetically stick it to the back of your phone. However, if all you care about is sound and it's not about 4.4mm versus 3.5mm or MagSafe or battery life, then strap in because this got interesting. I was shocked to hear the differences between the Mojo 2 and the RU9 with the RU9 running in its hybrid modern mode. Listening to Do What You Wanna, the most obvious difference between these two was in the bass. The bass line was tighter and reached deeper from the Mojo 2. I'd also say that detail and resolution was a little bit better from the Chord device. And this is really a perfect example of why balanced connections aren't the be all and end all. For convenience, I'm definitely a fan of 4.4mm connections because so many earphones and headphones these days come with only a 4.4mm plug. But when it comes to sound quality, it's really not a big deal. And what really surprised me here was that the RU9 couldn't even pull ahead with its sense of space and soundstage size, depth and three-dimensionality. At least, not in modern mode. Don't forget though, that the RU9 also has classic mode, and that changes the game. Of course, with more richness and smoothness, the classic mode is even less resolving than what you get from the Mojo 2, but it's hardly bad. And the RU9 makes its own strides here by becoming noticeably more spacious sounding, and also by smoothing off the top end a little bit in a wonderfully enjoyable way. With brighter or more aggressive headphones and/or tracks for that matter, the RU9 can be a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more enjoyable than the very clean and precise Mojo 2. Of course, the Mojo 2 does have a built-in EQ, so it's not exactly helpless here, but I love how quick and easy it is to add that sense of smoothness and expansiveness from the RU9 with just a click of a button. And so the RU9 is a product that I'm absolutely going to recommend here. It's a complete joy to interact with, it looks and feels great, and it sounds even better in whichever mode you prefer. I do still think that the xDuoo 5T and the Mojo 2 are great other options, and you'll need to decide which of them suits your tastes and your needs better. But for now, I'll put links in the description below to buy the Cayin RU9, and I highly recommend it to anybody that likes the sound of what I've just said. And then if you want a truly amazing auditory experience that happens to work beautifully with the RU9, but is equally as enjoyable without it, then you'll want to watch the video I've pinned here at the end next. For now though, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.